Hello, CIS27. In this video, I'm going to explain Chapter 11 task and also the content, which covers policies, incident response plan, and computer forensics. So in this week, the objectives are listed on your module page. We will talk about account management practices, going into operating procedure and agreement, and along with talking about incident response plan and computer forensics. You are to read Chapter 11, complete the Unit 11 in-class assignment, and complete Lab 11. On the next page, you will find Chapter 11 notes for this week. You can download the notes or view it on the page. So in the notes, it starts with talking about security policy. And just like all the things that we've covered, this is a very important area as it states the rules, what's allowed and not allowed in the organization. It includes the specific areas where we would implement configuration along with having the administration piece in security. So securities is just a written document that would lay out security plan for the company. And there are specific security policies. So for example, if you want to write a policy for encryption or other form of policy, you can also locate templates. And a good repository for templates is on SANS, and SANS offer different security templates. As you can see, there are different type of security policy that's listed here. So for example, if we wanted to look at acceptable use policy, you can expand this and you can download specific template. So acceptable use policy is going to describe the rules on how the equipment and the services are being used in the organization. It would have specific details on what's allowed and what's not allowed in an organization pertaining to internet service, external drives, devices, mobile devices, etc. And some company will break it down to additional policy. So you would find that in specific areas. So this is very important for employees, guest users, temporary users, and so on. Then you will also find additional policy like Bluetooth baseline requirement, data breach response. You can find additional email policy, encryption policy, and so on. So here gives you some template that you can use. And once you download the template, it would look something like this. So this is a template for acceptable use policy. And what you do is you're going to review the content, edit the content, add the appropriate organization name. So if I'm doing this for ABC Corporation, for example, I would go ahead and change this and add in the company's name. Once I go through, I need to review all the appropriate services and so on. So the purpose of the policy is to really outline, let's state that right here, on how the equipment is used and what would be acceptable use, what's allowed and what's not allowed. So we wanted to be very clear and specific to the actual allowance of the task and the devices that the user can operate using our systems and services. The scope, it would apply to electronic devices, computing devices, network resources, network appliances, and so on. So what you would do is you would edit the field information and you would make some adjustment in the scope as necessary. In the area of the policy, you would see that we would state the specific, what is allowed for access, what is allowed for share, what is the responsibility of the user and the employees, also pertaining to security and network. And if there's any additional policy like this, we would want to include that. Then in the area of mobile devices, we wanted to explain the rules that would be applied, how password would be implemented, and we can reference password policy where it would state more specific on how password would be used. Then we can list all the things that would be acceptable. Below, you would find unacceptable use. In that, we would state what is not allowed. And it's very important that we specify the violations in the case if they don't follow the rules. We would then state the repercussion of specific area, including written up, terminations, etc. So here, as you can see, how we would then list all the things that would not be allowed, like bringing in malware into the network, exporting software, technical informations, encryption information, and so on, fraudulent information, and also anything that would imply as outside of the normal job duty. Additionally, we also wanted to state things like that could risk our security area, like scanning internally, circumventing, and so on. So the more specific you are, the more clearly the rules are going to be set, so that way we would avoid some legal repercussion down the line. So it's important that we do that. And so it can go into email and communication activities, blogging and social media, because some companies are very sensitive in what is shared on the social network, and that will pertain to their information or private information or proprietary information in the company. Then in the next area, you would see that there would be policy compliance on how that would be for reporting purposes, auditing purposes, and so on. So as a compliance requirement, you have to have security policy in place in the organization and in order to make sure that we audit and we go back and we look at how we can update the security policy over time, as we would then update our systems or software or tools. So anytime that you have changes in your infrastructure, you would want to update your policy. And when we update policies, we wanted to make sure we follow up with the technical audit where we would look at configuration that would be parallel with the policy. And then in the next area, that will be just related standards on what would be other policies that would be tied to this or other standards. And you wanted to get into definitions and terms. And on the bottom, we can state the revision, when it was changed, what kind of change was done, and who did that. So in a security policy overall, from the beginning, we wanted to give an overview describing what it is, its purpose, its scope, include the body of it will be the rules of what's allowed and what's not allowed, and then following it up with additional compliance standards and other policies, definition of term, and the revision history. So this gives you an overall understanding of what a security policy template would look like and how you can use that template to be able to create a security policy. Now, in our notes, it talks about security policy, And this is a big area for the administrative control. It's allowing us to be able to reduce and manage our risk. And along with other things like developing security plan, we want to make sure that security policy is in place. And so as we saw in the template, that there would be high-level statements, goals, scope, and also organization principles. So you wanted to really address the type of practices that would be supported and allowed in the organization, along with the appropriate technical services and equipment that will be incorporated for daily operations. And standard operation procedures, your SOPs, this support our security policy. Procedures are step-by-step instructions on how they can perform a certain task or routine operations. So standard operation procedures would probably include things like if we're looking at updates, or if we're looking at downloading files for regular use in different departments. So procedures are different than policy in that procedure would be step-by-step instructions, whereas security policy would include the overall rules so that way the employees can follow. And in the management policy, we wanted to really define and clarify the issues that would be related to personnel management. And this you would need to tie in HR people to really clarify what would be some of the areas that you want to address. In these policy, we wanted to identify the plans and the procedures that will allow us to enforce those policies. So, for example, like sharing passwords, we want to prevent sharing passwords, and that would tie with passwords policy. And we wanted to write a procedure on how to create password and safely use password, but the policy would enforce the rules on how each employee needs to use their password. For example, we don't want them to be able to verbally share the password or have written notes of password and pass it around. And then also in other areas like personal downloads, shopping while working, using internet services for personal use, etc. So we wanted to tie this into policies that would allow the company to better manage the risks involving our equipment and system and our employees. So in the first question, it asks you, why is security policy important in the organization? It is used in the organization for administrative control. It allows us to manage risk and mitigate risks that would relate to our assets, which is our employees, our equipment, and how they use our equipment for daily operations. Question 2 asks you, what should the security policy include? And it should include brief, high-level statements that identify goals based on organization principles. And it should reference the standard operation procedure that supports the policy, and the procedure is different than the policy in that it has step-by-step instructions that employees can use to perform tasks or routine operations. In the next area, we're going to talk about acceptable use policy, which I showed the template from earlier. So acceptable use policy specify the rules or define proper system usage. And that would tie into what the employees should be doing, how they should use the systems, what's allowed and what's not allowed. It should describe the purpose of your organization systems, networks, and how the user can access them, and their responsibilities when they're accessing the systems. It should include definitions and example for unacceptable use. So usually you would see the organization require the user to read and sign acceptable use policy or a document indicating that they understand the acceptable use policy. And in violation of that, companies can carry out procedures on how to terminate employee or put them in warning and so on. So acceptable use policy is a very common policy that you would see that would help us protect the system and keep the employees aligned with what we want, how we want them to use the system. So in the third question, it asks you, what is AUP? The purpose of AUP is to define proper system usage, rules of behavior for employees when using information technology systems. And that can pertain to mobile devices, computer, desktop, laptop, and even our network environment. It describes the purpose of computer systems and network, how users can access them, and the responsibility of the users when they're accessing the systems. It includes definition and examples of unacceptable use, and in many cases, companies would include violations information, so that way we can see different level of violation, and that will help with the legal repercussion, as I mentioned. So as we proceed discussing the areas of administration, we would also look at things that would relate to human resource and personnel management. Often you would see that people don't take vacations. They can cover up a lot of the fraudulent activities. So to really help detect when employees are involved in malicious, fraudulent embezzlement activities, we need to enforce mandatory vacations. We can implement principle of defense and death along with mandatory vacations for protections. Because as they take vacations, we would have other individuals to be able to cover their task. And this is when we'll be able to really detect some of the areas that might imply fraudulent embezzlement or malicious activity. So we would need to enforce mandatory vacation policy. And in some cases, we would apply the separation of duties, which we're going to talk about next. But in a lot of cases, in addition to background check, monitoring, reporting, and so on, we need to really look at how we can have defense in depth and detect fraudulent activity or malicious activity that can cause disruption in our operation. And SOD, or separation of duties, is a principle that prevents a single person or an entity from being able to complete all the functions of the critical or sensitive process, meaning that for the major tasks, we wanted to have multiple individuals that would be involved, so that way a person, if they want to commit fraudulent activity, they can't just cover it up. It would entail other individuals' involvement, such as signing off, being able to really track the task, manage the resources, etc. So we wanted to include multiple people in the functions of the critical or sensitive process. And ultimately, that would help us prevent theft, fraud, or any kind of errors. And another area that we can look into is job rotation. So the concept of job rotation would require employees to rotate to different positions and learn processes and procedures in each job. So that way, as they do that, errors might be detected, fraudulent or theft activity might be detected. If you have one individual that would be in the same position for years, that can cause fraudulent issues, and or in some case errors, mistakes could be made. So this would help prevent dangerous shortcuts, fraudulent activity overall. And it works very well with your separation of duties. So when you implement SOD, we wanted to also implement job rotation. So in the next question, it asks you to explain why mandatory vacation, separation of duties, job rotation, and clear desk policy are important in securing business operations. These things help detect when employees are involved in malicious activity, fraud, or embezzlement. It also prevents fraud, theft, or errors. It helps prevent dangerous shortcuts, fraudulent activity. And lastly, in the clear desk policy, it prevents disclosure of sensitive data or data theft. Because clear desk policy requires that employees remove all the sensitive documents and clear that could be shredding or file that safely in a cabinet that would be locked. So that way it can prevent disclosure of sensitive data or data theft. So clean desk policy, you can find that on page 1 of our notes on the bottom. And clean desk policy just direct the user to keep the area organized and free of papers. Ask if they leave account information, credit card numbers, private information on papers on their desk, there is possibility that someone can take those documents and be able to extract those documents from the company. So what we want is we want to reduce the threat of security incidents by making sure that sensitive data is protected, and also prevent data theft or inadvertent disclosure of information. So the items that would impose risk in this policy would be keys, cell phones, access cards, sensitive papers, login information, printout on printers that could have sensitive data, passwords on post-it notes, unlocked or open file cabinets, mail with personal identifiable information being opened. On the next page, page 2 talks about background check. And background check is very important. And in California, we would apply 7 years background check. Anything beyond 7 years might not be applied to the current position, as there's legal requirement with that. So background check allows us to verify the history with the intention of discovering the individual characteristics, habits, performance tendency. And background check would include employment history, credit check, and in some cases, they would require criminal background. So as you know that in the area that we work in cybersecurity and information technology, we deal with a lot of sensitive data. So almost all positions would require background check when you apply for IT positions or cybersecurity positions. So it is expected for us to be able to provide background check of ourselves when we apply for these jobs. So it's important to be mindful of how you would be able to build up a good background for your future job. That means that we need to really maintain our credit and make sure that we don't default on credit cards, loans. Additional, we wanted to make sure that we have good employment history along with great legal background. Because without that, it's very difficult to get jobs in IT or cybersecurity. So for question 5, it asks you, in your opinion, is background check necessary? Explain your answer. And in this, I personally agree that background check can be used to identify characteristics, potential behavior, and performance tendencies and habits. It tells a lot about the individual, and historically, I've been a manager for a long time. So background check helped me understand about potential behavior or habits or how that individual might be performing in my organization before I hired that individual. So for question 5, you can state your opinion, but in general, you would see that most companies would require background check because that way they can see how that applicant or the candidate would be qualified for the positions and what is to be expected of that candidate. And when you work with highly sensitive information or company that uses highly sensitive information, they require that you sign a non-disclosure agreement, your NDA. And this is an agreement that's between two entities to make sure that proprietary data is not being disclosed or shared with other entities. So, for example, my interns who are interning for some company that is contracted with the Department of Defense, before they start the positions, they have to sign an NDA not disclosing proprietary information about those companies to other people, even family members. Nobody else is supposed to know about the details except for the organization and the employee. It prohibits employees from sharing proprietary data to non-employee individuals. So that would include family members, friends, acquaintances, people in general. And company would incorporate exit interview, and this is conducted for people who are leaving the organization. That would allow them to gain more information about the employees, about how they like or dislike their job, how adequate the training would be, and what would be the reason why they leave the organization, because high turnover could mean a problem within the company, and describe the relationship with supervisors, managers, if there's some kind of harassment that needs to be disclosed there. And also looking at how they could replace the individual. So exit interview is an important process. This is often conducted by human resource. And at this phase, we would remind the employee about the NDA, and NDA would be applied forever until that sensitive data, for the proprietary data, somehow become publicized. So the NDA would be required once, even when they leave the organization. While they're in the organization and when they leave the organization, it would still be applied. And the people who violate the NDA, they would then face legal repercussions. And during the exit interview, we wanted to collect badges, smart cards, and equipment. Could be mobile devices, things that the company would distribute to the employee when they were hired. So at the exit interview, this is when all those things would be collected. The onboarding process is to grant people access to resources to applications, to systems access when they get hired. And when the employee leave the organization, there gotta be an offboarding process. And this is when IT team would disable the account, removing the employee access to a different area of the network. Policy violation and adverse actions. This would require incident response for specific actions in the response. And that could relate to email usage, social media usage, advertisement, and peer-to-peer sharing. So if they leak data in email, we would then have to recover and be able to see where that leak has gone to. So that would require incident response. If people post proprietary information on social media, we would then have to recover from that by making sure that the details are removed and also taking proper legal and internal actions against that individual. And in the organization, you would see that there would be different type of agreements. Here's some of the information about agreements. Interconnection Security Agreement, that will be ISA. This specifies technical and security requirements such as planning, establishing, maintaining, and disconnecting secure connection between two or more entities. And that often you would see how a company would work with vendors, especially when vendors transfer or there got to be some access to resources that would be proprietary or sensitive. Service Level Agreement, your SLA, this is an agreement between the company and the vendor. It stipulates performance expectations. It's used for contractual services. So service level agreement could be agreement for delivery, for example, on monthly basis, or it could be for network connections from the internet service provider, or it could be from for construction purposes. So there would be a lot of different areas that a service could be rendered based on that particular agreement. Memorandum of Understanding, your MOU, or Memorandum of Agreement, your MOA. This would be an agreement between two or more parties for the intention of the work toward a goal. And that goal can be set by the organization, and if all the people that provide a certain type of service would be agreed upon, then they would sign an MOU or an MOA. Business Partner Agreement, your BPA, is a written agreement that would state the relationship between partners and would state how that partnership can be achieved, what kind of obligations that would be required in that partnership. And you would also see how company would classify the data. And this is a very important area because it helps IT and security team archive and label appropriate data or even encrypt some certain data. So in the process of information classification, first they need to identify the type of data. Then they would classify and label the data. And this would allow the user to understand the value of the data and how to protect the sensitive data. The example that I provided here is public data. Public data is for everyone to see. Doesn't necessarily be just employee, it could be just overall for everyone. Confidential data, that will be information that will only be intended to be secret amongst a certain group of people. So confidential data could be just for employees only or just for managers only. Proprietary data that would relate to the ownership. So if you're looking at Boeing, they would have proprietary data that incorporates the plane design, specific engineering processes, and details. Private data is the information that must remain private, and often you would see that relate to personal identifiable information or personal health information. So private data would pertain to private individual. And data labeling just ensures the user know how to handle and process the data. So we would then label it for specific use. And labeling would help backup media because the people who are performing the backup, they can quickly identify the value of the data and where that data will be stored. Data destruction and media sanitization. So after we have used the data and we no longer need the data, we can then purge the data. And purging pertains to sanitization term, that all the sensitive data have been removed from the device. So a way that we can wipe data clean is to zero out the disk. We can use the software where in that it would write all the zero for the storage area. We can do file shredding, remove all the remnants of the file, and again we can use the software in order to clear all of the files. Wiping is a process that completely remove all the data on disk. So when you delete the data, it doesn't necessarily goes away. We're going to make sure that we erase and overwrite everything. So we wanted to clear out, we want to zero out all the data on the disk and all the traces of the data all the way around. Burning is burn materials in incinerator, and this is a legacy way of doing things where they would throw everything into an incinerator and then it would burn it. But now we have proper way of how to be able to punch hole through our disk before we put it into recycling. Paper shredding is important. We wanted to shred all the documents and we wanted to shred it into small, tiny pieces so that way it cannot be pasted back together. Because people would dumpster dive and they can rummage through the trash and be able to find sensitive documents, piece it back together and use the information. So we want to make sure that we can properly shred it and dispose it. And there is service that people can use like Cintas. They would be able to pick up the shredded materials and properly dispose it. Pulping is reduce shredded paper into mash and puree. So these companies would then use pulping process to make sure that the shredded paper can be reduced into smaller materials that can be recycled. Degaussing is to apply electronic magnet into the disk that makes the drive unreadable. So that way our data cannot be passed on to other people who have access to the disk after it's disposed. Pulverizing is a process of physically destroying the media, and companies would have device that would be able to punch hole through the disk or break up the disk into smaller pieces so that way it would not be usable again. So in the next question, question 6 asks you, why is data classification important in an organization? It ensures the users understand the value of the data and protect the sensitive data. Because if they don't know what level is that data, they would not know how that data should be stored and how it should be protected. So it's a good way to really specify different level of importance of different type of data. And you often see that with government entity. So before we answer the next question, we can come back to the note. And here it talks about data retention policy. And by requirement, depending on the type of organization, you would see that companies or organization or institutions are required to retain data over a certain period of time. So for example, healthcare, they require to retain patient records for over 12 years. And some organization, they can retain data that would be inactive for over about 5 years and then dispose the data. And that can be different across. Communication company, they would retain your text messages for three years, and anything above 3 years could not be archived. However, in the year 1 through year 3, there would be if people would want to pull the data, they would then have to send in court subpoena information in order to obtain that type of data. And so in personal identifiable information, sometimes those would be required to retain, and some company would retain it for 5 to 7 years. It depends on the legal requirement for that type of company, like I mentioned. So PII is used to identify the individual, birth date, birthplace, social security information, address, driver license number, and it could also pertain to personal characteristics that ties to biometrics. Personal health information, your PHI, is used to identify individual health data, x-ray, prescription, medical records, diagnosis, etc. And the compliance is the area that we can look at the umbrella of how each company would fall under specific requirement. Compliance really tells us what is the legal requirement for that type of organization. So for healthcare provider, healthcare facility, insurance provider or health insurance provider, and any institutions that incorporate that store PHI, they have to fulfill Health Insurance Portability Accountability Act of 1996, which is HIPAA. It mandates that organization protect PHI, and all the record needs to be digitized and protected. The transfer of such records the transmission for that needs to be encrypted, and there gotta be protection measure in the network along with the system using the data. And to disclose the personal health information that needs to be requested and authorized. So if the entity is requesting that's not the individual, then there gotta be an authorization from the individual in order for the requesting entity to receive the information. GLBA, Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. This is required for financial services organization, and this includes Financial Services Modernization Act. It includes the financial privacy rules. It requires that financial institution provides its customer with privacy notice explaining how they collect and how the information is used. And this is why when you see banks sometimes send you notification, credit card companies send you notifications about how your privacy requirements have changed. If they had disclosed your information to another entity after they collect it, they have to notify the individual. And the individual would then, the consumer would then be allowed to opt out of those type of programs if needed. Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which is SOX, it requires executives within the organization that take responsibility for accuracy on financial reports, includes specific related auditing, identifies penalty for noncompliance, and SOX ties to companies that are that have stock exchange, company that are privately trading or publicly trading, that would require periodic report of the financial report, so that way there's no fraudulent and this is being managed by the SEC. So companies like Facebook, Google, and so on, because their stock is on the world market, exchange market, you would see that they're required to follow Sarbanes-Oxley Act. And with that, what you see is IT would require to maintain financial systems and making sure that financial system is periodically reporting, making sure that we audit, there's no fraudulent activities that's involved. And what, or we would then look at possibility of if there is internal trading and so on. So SEC would audit some of that. The roles and the responsibility. And when you're looking at the owner, that will be your data owner, the person who created the data and owned the data, the individual with the overall responsibility for the data. And that could be the individual within the organization, doesn't necessarily become the person who create or wrote that data. But you would see that companies who own the data, it's on their system, and the employees that generate the data is using their work hours to create that data. The steward or custodian, those are the people who handle routine tasks to protect the data, and that could be your sysadmin, support people, backup operators, and so on. Privacy officer, these are executive who's responsible for ensuring the organization is complying with the relevant laws, and that pertains to the last part. So to answer the next question, question 7, we can list HIPAA, which mandates organization to protect PHI, Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, GLBA, which requires Financial Services Modernization Act to include financial privacy rules. That requires financial institutions to provide customers with privacy notice explaining what they collect and how information is used. Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which requires executive within the organization that take responsibility to accurately report financial status. And it would specify information relating to how often they are auditing the data or financial information, and identify the penalty for noncompliance. And you can find this information again on our notes on page 3. So as incident would happen, we would have to have policies and procedures for incident response. And incident response policy help identify what kind of procedures we need to follow, who are the people who would then be carrying out those procedures. And in the procedures, it would list the activities, the steps on what needs to be done. And security incidents could be from attacks to inadvertently disclose information, to malware, to data leak, to breach. Could be a lot of different things. But under that, we can say that those are adverse event or series of events that can negatively affect confidentiality, integrity, and availability, CIA. So anything that jeopardizes the CIA, that will be classified under security incidents. And the IRP, or the Incident Response Plan, it provides more detail than the policy. It is an overall plan. It would include policy, procedures, and the details on how to respond to the incidents. So the coordinated plan on how to respond to the incidents would include the definitions of different type of incidents, cyber incidents, or it could be related to internal incidents, natural disaster incidents, Cyber incidents response teams, and that would include the individual that would respond to specific type of incidents that would relate to cyber. It could be cyber attack. Or then you also have the general teams and the roles of and the responsibility of those individuals on how certain things would be carried out in the case of the incident happening. Escalation personnel, who would be the individuals that we would report to, executive managers who would be able to escalate the incidents, and at one point we would have to notify law enforcement or public. So then that will be the reporting the requirements. So when it relates to there's legal impact, we need to notify law enforcement. And if it relates to company reputation, we need to notify its customers and so on, depending on the type and also the incidents that occurs and the type of company that we're dealing with. And then the plan would include exercises and practices before the incident happens, so that way we can prepare for potential incidents. And in the incident response process, we would first have preparation. This provides guidance to personnel on how to respond to an incident, such as, if you have a fire, there will be fire evacuation where the exit would be. We would want to practice it, so in the case of the fire happen, people don't get hurt. So in general, when we're looking at information system and that would relate to the instance, we want to have preparation. The second area is identification. We want to verify that it is an incident. So when it happens, we want to make sure that we verify it by identifying it accurately. After we identify the incidents, we want to contain it. So we wanted to isolate it and contain it so that way it doesn't spread. So in the case of malware, we want to make sure that we isolate the system, disconnect that system from our network. And so that way we wanted to make sure that that malware doesn't spread across. Eradication is the step 4. This is to remove components that cause the incident. And that could be individual or system itself. And step 5 is to recover, return the system to normal operation. So in the case of malware, after we contain it and we remove the malware, then we would then return that system to the regular operation. Lesson learned, we wanted to document, review the valuable lessons, document it so that way we can avoid it in the future. So we can update the policies, the rules, and then to be able to document the type of things that we've done in response to that particular instance, like a malware. So in the next question, we can answer number 8. What should be included in the IRP? Definitions of incident types, cyber incident response team information, which individual are going to be involved in responding to the incidents, their roles, their responsibility, their contact information. Escalation personnel, these are individuals who would need to escalate the incidents to higher ups. Reporting requirements, law enforcement, public, general executives, etc. And then exercises, practices on how we can better prepare for a certain incident. In the next area, we're going to talk about forensic procedures. So another area in cybersecurity is to really look into computer and networks to analyze the evidence, and that could be criminal activity related, or in the case of fraudulent, or just an incident that happens and we wanted to find out what had happened. So computer forensics is a way to analyze evidence from computers to determine details on the computer. And computer forensic overall is also, it encompasses network systems. And in this area, we would use specialized tools such as in-case forensic or forensic toolkit. There are many different types of toolkits that are available, some commercial, some open source, and we can use it to capture data so we can use it for analysis. Order of volatility is the order in which you should collect evidence, and collecting evidence require different steps, whether it's coming from hard drive, from network capture, from mobile devices. Collecting evidence with the most volatile point and moving to the least volatile point. So volatility pertains to losing the data when the power is removed. So in the case where if that data could be changed when the power is removed, it could be corrupted or erased, or it could be changed somehow, we would then start with that first. And so that's what order of volatility means. Use volatility in Kali. So we would then use the tool to be able to look into cache memory, processor, hard drive, cache, etc. Data in RAM, system and network processes, those are the things that would be next. Then page file or swap files on hard disk drive, because once we turn it off, it might not be available again. And then we can look into data storage for the local drive and archive media. Those are a little bit more permanent. So as you can see, as we move downward, we would see that cache memory and hard drive cache, those type of data would go away when you turn off the system. But then also data in RAM, that might not be permanent. And even in a permanent case, we wanted to be able to recover it next. And then we would then move into hard drive and permanent storage. So to answer question 9, it asks you, how is the order of volatility applied to computer forensic? And order of volatility just means that you would follow the order in which you should collect the evidence. We would collect the evidence with the most volatile point and move to the least volatile point. And volatile point pertain to losing the data when the power is removed. And if you're interested in computer forensic, there is a class in the fall. It's called CIS27A. And this class teaches specifically to computer forensic, and there are certifications that would relate to computer forensics. So in data forensic, we would capture information on RAM, on processor cache, on hard drive, and in most cases, we would capture the system image, which is the entire content of the drive, including the applications that are installed on the drive and the state of that system. And usually, legacy-wise, we would see bit-by-bit copy or write-protected copy. And we would use toolkits, system toolkits, to be able to capture the image. We can copy the image into a secondary drive that we would then use that drive to evaluate. We don't perform analysis on the actual main drive. We would analyze copy and image copy, not the original disk. So what are the things that we would look for? We'll look into hashes. We would look into network traffic, logs, surveillance video, record of time offset, timestamp, files that are stored, and so on. And during that process, we would take screenshots. We would interview witnesses if there are witnesses. And we would perform what's called chain of custody. And this is a process that provides assurances to control and properly handle the evidence after collection. So it requires that we document when things were collected, how it was collected, who is collecting the information, and as it passes hands, we would then document who is the evidence collection information going to, where is it stored, how is it stored, and so on. And we would use document control on forms, and it could be varied from one institution to the next. However, there are standard template for the forms that would be used. Some of the software tools, it actually has the form included, so you can fill out the form as you complete that process. So in the next question, it asks you, describe the chain of custody for number 10. The chain of custody is a process that provides assurances to control and properly handle the evidence after collection. Document control on form. So we wanted to provide all the details on the state of our evidence collection process, who collected it, what was collected, when it was collected, how it was kept, who it got passed to, and how it's stored. And in the next area, it talks about legal hold. So this would be required based on court order. And with the court order, then they would maintain different types of data as evidence. So under the investigation, like a company would be required to have a legal hold. So that means that their data is then being used as evidence. So email database, backup media could be pulled to be analyzed. Even current ongoing email or past email, old database records or existing database records, backup media, and so on, archive data, and so on. Recovery of data is a way that we would restore lost data, corrupted file, or backup. So in the case of an incident, data could be lost. So loss of data would then require us to go and restore the data and pull the data. And if it's corrupted, then we have to either pull it from the backup. If it's not available in the backup, we have to rebuild the data. Active logging is gather intelligence or counterintelligence by increasing data collection. So we can look at our sets of data and be able to have a better understanding of what is happening based on the active information in the log. So when we build the data, we would then track the amount of hours and expense that would be put into rebuilding the data. That would include response team information and time and expenses in the business budget. Overall, security can benefit so much from training, and we would train all the people, especially in incident response, based on the role, and they would learn the responsibility based on their role in the organization. So in an incident responder would then fulfill the responsibility based on the training that he, she, they received. And overall, everyone can benefit from continuing education, obtaining certifications, learning new tools, technology that's going to help the organization in responding to incidents and handling incidents properly, using tools that will be efficient for the amount of time and the budget that's being used. Compliance training, understanding the legal aspect on how to address some issues with the legal impact, And so that's important. And often you would see compliance training related to managerial positions. And then in the support positions, you would see these other areas. So compliance training also tie into the decision-making process on how that would carry, because there would be legal impacts in specific decisions that would be made for in the case of incidents or the overall security matter. And this concludes my lecture video for Unit 11. I hope that you're able to get a little bit more understanding on the administrative side of security and look into some different areas that we would handle incidents and be able to manage risks through policy procedures and following compliance requirements. Thank you for watching.